was the last week of summer. I was working as a junior counselor at an overnight summer camp. I had the late night shift, just hanging out at a picnic table in the center of a half circle of boys' cabins. It was light work. I could be reading and simply be present in case of a camper who needed the bathroom or couldn't sleep. Sometimes a case of homesickness. Nothing terribly eventful ever came up. I didn't mind the duty. The kids were fast asleep, and the forest buzzed with the usual song of crickets and peeper frogs. I lay on my back on the picnic table, with my book on my chest, watching a solitary satellite slide across the sky. Suddenly, something broke the repetitive chorus of bugs and frogs. A crunch. Faint, but clear enough. Like a footstep on gravel. The rest of staff were either in the counselor's lodge or scattered around the cabins, already asleep. Another crunch, closer this time. I got to my feet, my heart rate quickening, and grabbed the flashlight from the bench. "Hello?" I called into the dark, trying to soften my voice enough for the campers to stay asleep. No response, just the murmur of the trees bending in the breeze. I started toward the direction the sound had come from, the beam from my flashlight crawling across the grass ahead of me. As I crept forward, away from the cabins and into the dark, I realized how heavily I was breathing. I tried to control it. But alarms began sounding in my head as my sneakers scraped the driveway gravel. The sound was identical to those I'd just heard. Squinting across the driveway to the forest, I saw a shape, unnatural among the tree trunks. A figure, barely visible, near the edge of the woods, very still. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking a little. I tried to sound confident, but I'm certain that I didn't. "Camp's off limits after hours. You can't be here." The figure didn't move. I still wasn't certain that I was looking at anything other than a tree stump or a heap of branches. I swallowed hard, taking a step closer. I'd been gripping the flashlight so tightly that I was intermittently pressing the button, causing the bulb to click off and on. It flickered for a long moment, and my stomach twisted. When it steadied again, the space among the trees was empty. The figure was gone. A cold chill ran through me. I quickly scanned the trees left and then right, but there was nothing, just brush and pine boughs swaying sleepily. Backing away slowly, I tried to make a plan. Pacing quickly back to my picnic table, I looked from cabin to cabin. Every door remained closed. I snatched my walkie off the table and checked the channel before powering it on. "This is Mark. Is anyone on in the lodge?" I didn't bother dressing up the panic in my voice. As I waited for a response, I stared out into the dark, where that figure had been standing. I'd never heard of anything like this happening before. Someone had to be pranking me. I was still gripping the radio when static hissed through the speaker, followed by a welcome voice. "Mark? What's going on?" It was Greg, the head counselor. He was usually calm, but there was an edge to his tone. I stared out at the tree line, heart hammering. "I saw someone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "At first they were on the driveway, near the upper boys' cabins. Then they were hiding in the woods. Couldn't tell who it was, but they wouldn't answer me when I called to them. It's either someone messing with me or someone who shouldn't be here." There was a long pause. Then Greg replied, "Stay where you are. I'll be there in a few." Please hurry. Take the golf cart, I begged. He didn't answer. The walkie hissed menacingly in the silence. I nodded to no one, eyes fixed on the shadows. He's coming, I murmured to myself. Then louder. They're all coming. You hear that, weirdo? I had seen animals out here at night. Raccoons, the occasional deer. But this was different. This was someone creeping around camp in the dead of night. I decided to start locking the cabin doors. It couldn't hurt. If this ended up being nothing, I'd go back and unlock them before I went to bed. Radio still clutched in one hand, flashlight in the other. I turned and started to the closest cabin. As I reached the porch steps, the crunching sound returned, closer this time. The sound, louder, and repeated. The footsteps suddenly grew quick, deliberate, like someone trying to close the distance between us. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the driveway and trees. And there he was. He stood just at the opening of the half moon of cabins, partially concealed by the shadows, though I could make him out clearly now in the glow of the porch lights. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by some kind of fabric mask. I pointed my flashlight directly at him. The moment the light hit him, he darted forward. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. My foot caught on the porch step and I fell hard, my back slamming against the wood. Pain shot up my spine, but I barely noticed. The figure was coming straight for me. Scrambling to my feet, I barely managed to grab a lacrosse stick, leaning against the side of the building. My heart raced as I swung it wildly in a useless arc in front of me. He stopped just short, hands twitching at his side like he was deciding when to lunge. For a brief second, I caught a glint of something. Was it a jar? In his hand. We stood there, eyes locked, the air thick with tension. He was close enough that I could see his chest rise and fall with every breath. He wasn't just a trespasser. This guy meant harm. Before I could make another move, I heard the sound of more footsteps. Heavy and fast. Greg, along with two other counselors, came charging toward us, their flashlights cutting through the dark. The intruder hesitated, his gaze darting between me and the approaching lights. He seemed to make up his mind all at once. In a flash, he'd lifted the jar in his hand and heaved it toward me. A liquid splashed on my face and chest. It was a split second after that my brain processed the smell. Gasoline. He took one more look at my coworkers approaching, and then, without a sound, he turned and bolted back into the woods. Greg shouted after him, but I knew it was pointless. He was gone. Panting, I dropped my makeshift weapon, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Greg reached me first, eyes wide. "Mark, are you okay? Did he hurt you?" I shook my head, still staring at the spot where the guy had just been standing. He was... I swallowed. He had something. He tossed gas on me. I think he was going to... I didn't have to finish. Greg's face paled, and he looked out toward the woods. "We need to lock down the camp. I'll call the police." We huddled together, the counselors taking turns, scanning the dark with flashlights. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd come back. Whoever he wasn't done. He didn't get to do what he came to do. And next time, I was afraid I wouldn't be so lucky. It was supposed to be a harmless thrill. Just me, Joe, and Matt, sneaking out of the cabin after lights out. We weren't going far. Just down to the lake to do what campers do. Dare each other to swim in the freezing water. Maybe then we'd go to the amphitheater to tell some ghost stories. It was more about sneaking out than what we did once we'd snuck out. You know how it is. We slipped out around 1 a.m. Our counselor was dead to the world on his bunk. Everyone here ran around like crazy all day and slept hard at night. I woke to Joe, shaking my shoulder and whispering, "Let's go." The camp was still and silent, only the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the stillness. Campers told stories about a mean security guard who wandered the camp all night, but no one had ever seen him. We had agreed that we would take our chances. I thought I'd be scared sneaking through the woods, but being with the guys made it feel more like a game. And it was like a game, until we saw the light. A faint glow up ahead, just off the main path. I tugged on Matt's sleeve, motioning for him to stop. Joe grinned. "Probably the counselor's having a late night meeting," he whispered, raising his eyebrows. "Should we check it out?" I asked, half joking. Joe shrugged, but Matt was already moving toward the light. It felt like we had no choice but to follow. If he got caught, we were all busted. As we got closer, we could hear voices. Low, unclear. But it wasn't the normal chatter of adults winding down after a long day. It sounded off, urgent, and repetitive. We crouched behind a row of bushes, peeking through the gaps. What we saw made my stomach turn. The counselors, our counselors, were standing in a circle around something or someone. I recognized Miss Katie, who ran the arts and crafts morning activity. And there was Tim, the loud guy who led all the funny campfire songs. But they weren't laughing or joking. They were murmuring, staring down at whatever was in the center of their huddle. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. Just a bundle of something dark and still. But then I saw it move, jerking, like someone tied up and struggling inside a sack. My heart hammered in my chest. Tim knelt down, holding something shiny in his hand. I thought it looked like a knife. He raised it high above his head, the metal gleaming in the light of a single lantern they'd placed nearby. Then the chanting started. I say chanting because I don't know what else to call it. It was low, muttering, but in unison. It was a language I didn't recognize. I did not want to be there anymore. I did not want to be seeing any of this. But it felt like the woods were pressing from behind, and this horrifying spectacle was ahead. I wanted to run, to bolt back to the cabin and pretend none of this was happening, but I couldn't move. Joe and Matt were clutching me from either side. Matt leaned in closer, trying to get a better look. He must have knelt on a twig, because it snapped with a loud crack. Everything stopped. The chanting, the movement, they all froze. The counselors turned their heads in perfect unison toward the bushes where we were hiding. Their eyes gleamed back the lantern light wide and unblinking. I felt a scream crawling up my throat. But then suddenly something changed. Miss Katie was the first to break the tension. She blinked. Her eerie, wide-eyed stare softening as if waking from a dream. She looked at Tim, who lowered his arm, no longer holding the knife like a weapon, but as if he just realized it was in his hand for no reason at all. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Oh, hey guys," she called out, her voice completely normal, like we'd caught them playing cards instead of whatever the hell that had just been. "What are you doing here? Isn't it past your curfew?" Tim joined in with a casual grin. "We were just cleaning up after a staff meeting. Didn't expect an audience." The others laughed lightly, their faces softening, bodies relaxing, as if the eerie ritual we'd witnessed had never happened. The weird chanting, the knife, the thing in the center. It was all gone now, like a fog lifting. I momentarily doubted that I'd seen anything in the middle of their circle at all. The way their group stood now, it was hard to see beyond them between their legs. Come on, you guys know the rules, Miss Katie said, stepping toward us like everything was fine. You should be in your bunks. Joe let out a shaky laugh. Yeah, sorry, we're just, heading back. Matt, usually fearless, was the first to stand, glancing nervously down at us. Yeah, guess we'll get going, he muttered. I wanted to say something, to demand an explanation, but my words were stuck in my throat. The way they'd snapped back to normal was so wrong, so unnatural. It was like they were playing a part now, pretending nothing had happened. Good night, boys, Tim called after us as we hurried away, his voice calm and casual, robotically calm. As we stumbled back toward the cabin, I chanced one look over my shoulder. The counselors were still standing there, watching us with pleasant, harmless smiles on their faces. But in the flickering lantern light, I saw it. The gleam of that knife still in Tim's hand. I could see that his fingers were clenching the blade itself instead of the handle. I swear I saw blood dripping from his palm. That was my last summer at that camp. It was some anonymous evening in late July, and the air was buzzing with excitement. It was the night of our annual Monster Capture the Flag game. The kids loved it, racing all over camp and in the woods, wearing their spooky costumes, trying to sneak across this field or that without getting caught by the other team. There was always extra anticipation about this game because we'd play in the dark. As a counselor, I was supposed to keep watch, make sure no one was hurt, or, was more often the case, wandered too far out of bounds. It was a bit of a fool's errand because there was barely any organization and no way to count the kids until after the final whistle blew at 10 p.m. The moon swung bare over the camp, creating eerie shadows through the pines, a fitting stage for a spooky round of Capture the Flag. Each counselor and camper wore some kind of get-up: zombies, werewolves, vampires, running and hiding, laughing and yelling through the dark. I was stationed near the edge of the woods, keeping an eye on a particularly dense section of trees where the kids like to hide. I was dressed as some kind of generic ghost, my white sheet billowing as I moved quietly between the trees. I'd grown tired of the costume minutes into the game and now pulled it off. Balling the sheet up, I crammed it into the crotch of a tree nearby. The campers would have to be all right with at least one counselor dressed up as a somewhat tired-looking 20-something for the duration of the evening. I heard some brush moving and a branch snap behind me. Before I could turn to look, I heard footsteps close by. I spun around, expecting to see one of the kids. Instead, I saw a dark figure standing just at the edge of the woods. A tall person wearing a full black mask. There were no eyes, no holes in the face at all, just this smooth, featureless surface. I smiled, thinking it was one of the other counselors trying to spook the campers or me. That mask is something else, man, I called out, but the figure didn't respond. They just stood there, facing me. All right, you win the creepiest costume award, I added with a laugh. But again, nothing. Slowly, the figure turned and faded into the woods, moving with an unsettling smoothness. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Shaking it off, I turned back toward the field, keeping an eye on the kids running around, shrieking happily. Maybe the costume was someone's idea of a joke. Stalking off into the woods without getting a good scare out of me made me second guess that, though. As the night went on, that same figure appeared again and again, always at the edge of the woods, always just watching, always moving just out of range before I could get a good look. I didn't give them the satisfaction of calling out again, but I also didn't turn my back until they'd left. It was easy enough to distract myself and excuse this admittedly odd person as part of the general chaos and madness of the game. When I had the chance, I started asking around. None of the other counselors knew anything about a masked figure, but something else was wrong. I became convinced that they were missing kids. First, it was Jeremy, one of the younger campers. I'd seen him one moment beside the tree line, and the next thing I knew, he was gone. I knew he didn't come back toward the playing field past me. The playing field had really thinned out. Were other kids MIA too? Then, Layla, a counselor who had been keeping score. Suddenly, no one had seen her. I told myself, kids were probably just hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike in the game. Or that Layla had snuck off to smoke. But as the night went on, more people seemed to vanish. It wasn't like anyone was noticing at first. Everyone was too caught up in the excitement of the game. But then I started to hear concerned, raised voices. A couple of kids came up to me, saying they couldn't find their teammates. Now, other counselors began asking me about this figure. Where had I seen him first? Why didn't I raise the alarm? Were they armed? I noticed a camper eavesdropping. He caught my eye and ran off guiltily. Right away, I knew panic was about to spread through camp like a case of mono. I decided to head into the woods. If someone was pulling a prank, they'd gone too far. And if kids were lost, I needed to find them. The deeper I went, quieter it got. No laughing, no running. Just the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. My foot, I thought. Trees pressed in close. And for the first time all night, I felt genuinely alone. That's when I saw the figure again, closer this time, standing next to a large, fallen tree. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A shaft of moonlight stole through the trees and lit on him. Now I could see the mask more clearly. It certainly wasn't plastic. It was smooth, like stone, but it had this sheen to it, as if it was living flesh. I didn't say anything this time, I just stared. And then the figure turned and slipped behind the tree. My fear was temporarily overcome by annoyance. I rushed forward, calling out, "Whoever you are, this isn't funny." But as I rounded the tree, there was no one. Just darkness and more trees stretching away from me. Then, something strange caught my eye. There was a large pile of leaves on the ground, unnaturally shaped, like something was hidden underneath. I knelt down, pushing the leaves aside, and my fingers brushed against something soft and cool. A hand. I swept back the rest of the leaves, revealing Layla, unconscious, her costume rumpled and dirty. I shook her, tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't stir. Her breathing was shallow, but there. I looked around, feeling a distinct presence, like someone was watching me. In fact, it wasn't like someone was watching me. Someone was watching me. I was certain of it. I didn't want to leave her there, but I couldn't carry her back on my own. I had to get help. As I began to rise, I heard the squeak of footsteps on damp grass behind me. Slowly, I turned. The figure was there, no more than 10 feet away, standing completely still. This couldn't be a coworker in a costume. The face, or lack thereof, was so impossibly dark and deep. As I stared into that void, where a face should have been, I began to feel dizzy, like I would fall into the thing at any moment. With real effort, I forced myself to buck backward, grabbing at a branch as I fell. I was more vulnerable now than before, but the figure didn't move. It just tilted its head slightly, as if considering me, and then it reached out. There was no suggestion of violence or threat in the gesture. I think it was beckoning me to come closer. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that blank, smooth face. Then, in a flash, it moved. It was so fast I barely registered it until it was gone, vanishing into the woods, as if it had never been there at all. I ran, aimlessly tearing through brush and fallen trees. I couldn't say how, but I made it back to the main field, breathless and shaking. I found the head counselor and tried to explain what I'd seen, but it was chaos. More campers and staff were missing. They'd organized a search party, but I couldn't bring myself to go back into the woods. Layla was found later, along with the other missing kids and counselors. Some of them were blanketed under brush or leaves. Others just ambled out of the woods on their own, looking dazed. None of them remembered what had happened, or if they did, they wouldn't let on. They were just gone for a while, like they'd fallen asleep in the middle of the game. No one believed my story about the masked figure in the end. They chalked it up to the game, to nerves, to the darkness playing tricks on me. I barely bothered to argue. It didn't matter. More than anything, I just didn't want to talk about it. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in my bunk, and I can hear the wind wandering through camp, I think about that thing, about how it cocked its head and looked at me, about how it's still out there, close, in the woods behind camp, waiting for me.